So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to spend an hour, maybe a little less, depending on how quickly I talk with me today, to talk about a topic that might be a little tough, right? I think grief is something that we all experience at some point in our lives. We all have losses, right? Whether that's through the passing of a loved one or maybe loss of a job or maybe expectations that aren't met, right? Grief can take many, many forms just as loss can take many, many forms. And so I appreciate you guys having the courage to show up today to talk about something that can be a little taboo, but is very, very widely experienced throughout our entire species. So before I get into the information today, if you would be so kind as to put your email address in the chat box, if you would like to participate in the post survey. So for those of you who don't know, every training I do, I offer a survey at the end through an email. And that is an opportunity for you to give me feedback on this presentation. And also, if you have a topic that you would like for me to cover in the future, this is your opportunity to share that with me. And I do take your feedback very seriously. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't hurt my feelings if you don't like what I have to say. So please be honest. I appreciate all of your words. They help me grow and they help me help you better. Okay. So if you would like that survey, please put your email address in the chat and I will send it to you after our time together today. Okay. And also, all of our trainings are recorded and put online on our website, alabamarespite.org, and also on our YouTube channel. You just go on YouTube and type in Alabama Lifespan Respite and we'll pop up. So if there's something you want to revisit from today, or if you want to share it to somebody else, or share it with somebody else, you'll have the option to do that. We usually, in my trainings in the morning and usually by the afternoon on Fridays or early Monday, they're shared there. So if you'd like that, it'll be available within the next couple days or so. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this anticipatory grief topic here. And as I go along, if you all have questions or comments or anything you want to share, this probably won't be a super long training because I'd only have like 11 slides. But just put it in the chat and we can talk about it afterward. I'll stop the recording and we can have a conversation. Or if you don't want to put in the chat and you're better than I am about remembering what you're going to say, you don't have to write it down. You can just wait till the end and we can unmute and have a conversation. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started here. Let me get myself situated. Okay. So our agenda today, we're going to define anticipatory grief. Some of you may have never even heard that phrase before. So we're going to define it. And then we're going to talk about the signs. So sometimes you may be experiencing this and may not even realize that that's what you're experiencing, right? So it's good to know what the symptoms are, what the signs are, because then once we know what we're experiencing, we're better equipped to learn how to tackle that, right? And then we're going to ask, are there any benefits to anticipatory grief? And then I'm going to give you 5 ways to help you work through it. And I'm going to end with unresolved grief symptoms and strategies to cope with that as well. Okay. So I do want to be sensitive with the topic. It's a necessary topic. I feel like it, but I also understand that, some of you may not be in a headspace or heart space to really tackle it right now. And so if going through this proves to be a little bit much for you, I completely understand. If you just want to bow out of the training and revisit it later, it does not hurt my feelings, I promise you. But I do want to let you know that if at any point you feel like you want to reach out to me and do a care chat, you can call me, you can email me, and I'll give you that contact information again before we end today. So that way I can help you or just offer an invitation. So if you need a soft place to land, I'm here for you to do that, okay? All right, so what is anticipatory grief? Well, I'll let you know, it's incredibly common, okay? And like I said before, some of you may not even realize that that's what you're experiencing, and so you don't have a name for it. But once we go through what it is, the definition of it, I'm sure a lot of you will be like, oh, yes, I know exactly what that is, right? So anticipatory grief is a state of deep and painful sorrow that occurs before an impending loss. Now, remember, loss doesn't have to necessarily be the end of a life. It could be, any loss that we experience. But in the context today, we're going to talk about it in the context of losing a life, somebody passing away, okay? So you can grieve before that loss happens, right? Sometimes we lose somebody and it's unexpected and you don't have anticipatory grief because you weren't anticipating it, right? But if you're a caregiver for somebody who is nearing the end of their life, um, anticipatory grief is probably just going to show up and bite you right in the butt. You won't even realize it's happening. But it happens as you anticipate the loss, right? And it can affect people facing that impending death of a loved one or even their own death, right? So if you're caring for someone who knows they have a terminal illness, maybe they do have an understanding that their disorder, their disability or disease is going to limit them and limit their life, they will also experience anticipatory grief for the loss of their own lives, right? And the term is often used in the context of death, but again, it can be anything that's not related to death. It is common both among caregivers and your loved ones that are being cared for. And here's the real fun part. It usually happens at the same time. So you're grieving, they're grieving. And so a lot of the symptoms I'm going to talk about today, just keep in mind that this might be something your loved one is also experiencing in tandem with you. Okay. Anticipatory grief is more than just normal grieving that starts early, right? Sometimes people think, well, I'm going to grieve now, and then when the passing happens, I'll be fine, right? I'll get it out of my system. Well, grief, unfortunately, is not a finite thing, right? There's no determined size. So it's like, well, if I get, 3 feet of grief out now, then I've only got 7 more to go, right? That's not the way it works, right? It's a different thing in and of itself. Okay, so you may experience anticipatory grief, but that doesn't mean that you won't experience the grief after the loss as well. Okay, it's not something that you get out of your system beforehand. Okay. Anticipatory grief is often regarded as a means to process and resolve issues related to a dying person or life-changing event. Okay, so this could provide you with the means to proactively address your feelings and the likely consequences of the loss, right? So dealing with them now rather than after the fact. So this could be a space where you maybe make amends, right? Say things that you don't want to have left unsaid, or maybe even just do like really practical things, like getting their affairs in order, right? Financial things, living wills, and all that stuff, right? Making sure that you have all your ducks in a row in that way. Okay. But of course, with any grief reaction, there's no set amount of time that a person will grieve, right? We all grieve in individual ways. There's no timeline for grief. And experiencing anticipatory grief before the death of a loved one does not mean that the grief after the loss will be less. Okay, it won't soften the blow. It's really just kind of just another thing, right, that you experience, right? They're two separate things and you'll probably experience both of them. Okay, so every relationship is as unique as the individual themselves, and so your grief will always be distinct to that special tie that you have with your loved one. Okay, and I want to pause here and really bring home the point that if you are experiencing anticipatory grief and your loved one passes and you are still experiencing grief in a very intense way, that's not wrong. Okay, that doesn't mean that you did it wrong. That doesn't mean that you're broken. Okay, that's absolutely normal. It's probably it's so normal it's expected, right? It's common. It's a known process. Okay, so don't beat yourself up if you're like, well, I already grieved this. No, honey, you didn't, right? And you're probably never going to not be grieving it, right? It's just going to get easier to manage, right? Okay, so anticipatory grief versus grief after death. What is the difference? Okay, so of course, anticipatory grief is very similar to what we consider conventional grief, the grief that happens after a death, because they involve a lot of the same emotions. Okay, so we think about grief and maybe there's some anger, there's some anxiety, there's sorrow, right? Maybe there's some guilt, right? That doesn't go away just because you felt it before the death. Okay, that's just what it's going to be, right? But with conventional grief, the emotions you experience, they are a direct consequence of the loss, right? But anticipatory grief is the grief that you expect to experience. Okay, so it's a grief in and of itself, but it's also the expectation or the anticipation of that grief. Okay, and this is really going to be a lot of it is going to be conceptual, and they will change over time. Okay. It's often described as a roller coaster because you can shift back and forth between feelings of distress for several days and then feeling normal for several days, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm experiencing anticipatory grief and it's a 24/7 experience. You can bounce back and forth, right? You can have moments where the reality sets in and you're grieving, and you take time to grieve. And then there's other times where it's business as usual, right? You're experiencing joy and you're experiencing happiness and you're having those wonderful times with your loved one. And so again, it's not fixed, it's not said. If grief pops up when you don't expect it to, that's normal, right? Expect the unexpected because it's going to sneak up on you, okay? Um, and with anticipatory grief, there might actually be part of you that's kind of hoping that maybe the diagnosis was wrong, the prognosis was wrong. And so you could be at one moment feeling, safe and like elevated. And then the next one, it can trigger intense anxiety or grief. Okay. So expect to be all over the place. All right. And I'll give you some strategies to cope with that as we go forward. And with conventional grief, your emotions and actions are reactive, right? And with anticipatory grief, your emotions are going to be proactive. Okay. But again, they're going to share a lot of similarities. It's just about the time that they are experienced. So what are the symptoms, right? Now that we know kind of what the difference is, what are the symptoms? And you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of overlap between anticipatory grief and the grief post-loss, okay? So the first one, and again, these are not going to be, this isn't like a, end all be all list of feelings, okay? These are just broad strokes that I'm painting with, okay? Because my hope is that you can see yourself in this and feel validated, right? I want to normalize this for you so you maybe have some solid ground to stand on. So the first one is the loss of control of your emotions, okay? So that could be intense sadness, tearfulness, and that can come out of nowhere or just be easily triggered, right? Sometimes we have those bittersweet moments, right? Where maybe our loved one, you guys are having a good moment together and, it hits you like a ton of bricks that, this isn't going to last forever, right? And that can trigger those emotions that come that you might not be experiencing all the time, but they'll come up, kind of sneak up behind you, right? Next one, fear, irritability, and anger. Okay, so beyond the fear of death, you might fear the changes that are going to follow after a death, right? Especially if you've been caregiving for a long time, that's your identity in a lot of ways, right? And so when that role is no longer necessary, who are you at the end of that, right? You've probably changed a lot from the beginning when you got the diagnoses to where you are now, right? There's a lot of growth, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of shedding of skin in that space. And so, that change can be scary and it can cause a lot of fear, right? Um, and you might feel anger, right? You might be angry at the diagnosis. You might be angry at the situation you're in. You might not even have a place for your anger to land. You just know you're angry, right? Making you irritable. And that's all normal, okay? That's all normal. But in addition to dealing with your own anger and your own fear, you may have to deal with the anger and the fear of the person who's passing, right? Again, you're probably experiencing these feelings along with them. They're having their own moments of anger and fear and grief and all that themselves. And so that also is just going to compound your own. Next, loneliness and isolation. Okay, so it's not uncommon to find people backing away from you during a serious health crisis, right? We all know this. Unfortunately, that's just the reality we're in. Sometimes people just don't know how to respond. And so they just, kind of distance themselves a little bit, right? But you also may feel lethargic, maybe unmotivated in this space. And so you're the one who's withdrawing, right? Because you don't know how to deal with it. You don't know how to talk about it. Or maybe you're like, I don't want to talk about it. And every time I'm around cousin Jane, she wants to talk about my feelings. And I don't want to talk about my feelings, right? So you withdraw, okay? So that, of course, they might be pulling away. You may be pulling away. And that is going to just create a fertile ground for loneliness and isolation to flourish, right? So, but again, that's not to shame you at all. That's just to let you know that if you experience this, it is common, it is normal, and it is valid to feel these things, okay? Next, anxiety, right? I think whether we have a loved one we're caring for or not, Anxiety is just kind of the bread and butter of our culture in a lot of ways. It's just kind of like, it's in everything, right? Anxiety can be in good things and bad things, right? But especially for caregivers, you probably are feeling like you're in that heightened state of anxiety, right? It's unrelenting. It doesn't end. It's just kind of the background noise of your life now. But this can have a lot of negative effects on you if it's left unchecked, obviously. And some of that can manifest in physical symptoms, like maybe you start to get a tremble or a tremor, right? Maybe you feel like you're always on edge, so you're very irritable and you bite back a lot more quickly than you used to. Maybe you're having, racing heart, right? You're anxious and your body, your nervous system's responding to that anxiety and it's causing that racing heart. And that's normal, okay? And it's good to have a toolbox so that way when you feel those feelings, you know how to bring yourself back down to a baseline where you're comfortable and you can still function. And if you're struggling with that, please reach out to me. I do have a skill set and I can teach you how to bring yourself back down to a state of calm, even among the chaos. Okay, so don't do it alone. There's always ways that you can get help. Next, guilt. So this is a big one. I feel like guilt is something that kind of hovers in the caregiving space unnamed a lot of the times. We almost feel ashamed that we feel guilt, whether that's, we feel guilty that we aren't doing what we think we should be doing, or maybe we feel guilty that we're taking time away from our loved ones suffering to nurture ourselves, right? But especially when you think about grief, right? Somebody passing, feelings of grief can occur because maybe you, or not grief, but guilt can occur because you want your loved one to be free of pain, but that might mean that they pass, right? Or it might mean that you want them to stay even if they're suffering. Okay, so there's a lot of conflicting feelings there, and there's a lot of fertile ground again for guilt to flourish in that space. But I just want to encourage you that that's normal. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry, and I encourage you not to carry it alone. Okay, but if you feel guilt because you're like, man, I don't want my loved one to pass away, but this is really hard for both of us, and it might even in your mind be, framed as almost like a mercy, and then you feel really guilty for that, right? It's like immediately like, oh gosh, I can't believe that even came across my mind, right? But it's normal, okay? It's normal to not want to see somebody suffering. And then on the flip side, it is normal to not want to lose somebody that you truly love and care about, even though they're suffering, right? So again, it's very complex. There's not a lot of cut and dry stuff to our feelings, right? It's always very multi-layered and can be really hard to navigate. Next, an intense preoccupation with the dying person. So this can occur to the point of fixation, right? And it can make it difficult for you to manage your daily living, your health, your work, right? Because you're so fixated on how's mom, how's dad, how's brother, how's sister, how's whomever that you're taking care of, right? And then that means like that is not the priority, it is the only priority. And that includes you showering, eating, sleeping, right? Resting, any of that stuff, right? So that is a sign of anticipatory grief, right? Where you are just, almost obsessively concerned and preoccupied with that person. And of course, there are moments where, you have to be in that space, right? Where you have to be providing care intensely and you can't take those breaks and you can't step away. And I understand that. But again, if this is like an all consuming thing for you, that could be an indicator that you're experiencing anticipatory grief. Okay. And then finally, the rehearsal of the death. Okay. So maybe you're visualizing what life looks like after they pass, right? What is your life going to look like without them? Maybe you're wondering how are you or the rest of your family going to carry on after your loved one passes, right? Again, remember I said that sometimes you become a caregiver, like that's your identity. And so when you think about your loved one passing, you might be thinking, what does that look like for me on the other side, right? What does that look like for my kids on the other side? What does that look like for, other family members that are involved, right? So that's not uncommon to lay in bed at night and think, what's it going to look like after? Okay. So again, this is just to validate your feelings. You may not feel all of these. You may only feel one or two. You may feel all of them all the time, and it's really overwhelming. But again, there's no right or wrong way to experience anticipatory grief. It is just what it is, right? And it's going to be different depending on who you are and the relationship you have with your loved one. Okay. So next, are there any benefits to anticipatory grief? I think it's kind of an interesting question because I think to myself, if something benefits you, you can think, well, this is something I chose, right? But you don't really choose to feel these feelings; they just show up, right? But maybe by kind of framing it and seeing if there's benefits to it, we're less likely to resist the process, right? And maybe try to find a silver lining in a really dark space. Okay. So there are studies on this. Obviously, we study everything, which is great. And the results are kind of conflicting, right? Whether this anticipatory grief is beneficial or not. And it really does depend on the individual. Okay. Some people may experience anticipatory grief and it just deepens their grief and it prolongs it, and they are not proactive in this space, and it's just an extension of their pain, right? And we can think, well, that's really not going to benefit them really at all. But some people, it can help them sort out their feelings or prepare for moving forward. Okay, so it can be not a space that they find themselves sinking into, but a signal that they need to be proactive, that there's the steps that they need to start taking to make the process easier for themselves. Okay, so again, it's really just about the individual. But people who are experts in the field of bereavement, they say that anticipatory grief can allow a person to confront their fears rather than avoid them, right? So if you say like, wow, I'm grieving this loss, I'm aware that the loss is about to occur. Let me be proactive. Let me think about, what is this? What do I fear in this space, right? Let's not avoid it. Let's go ahead and face it head on. Okay. It can help you deal with any unfinished business, and that can be practical or emotional. Again, getting affairs in order, getting the right paperwork in order, making sure all the arrangements are made, right? And giving that time. Oftentimes we lose somebody and we don't expect it. And so there's no plan made, there's no preparation. And so you're kind of scrambling in that space. So anticipatory grief can be a benefit in that regard, that you have time to set things up, right? So that when the loss happens, you have space to actually just be present and grieve rather than be distracted by all the to-dos. Now, there's going to be to-dos, obviously, there's always going to be those, but maybe it won't hit you as hard because you have that time to prepare and do what you can beforehand, okay? And also emotional, right? Maybe you have time to have those conversations with your loved one that maybe you've been putting off, right? Maybe if you're caring for somebody and your relationship has kind of been a little iffy, right? Maybe there's some things, maybe some traumas or unresolved feelings. And so you can kind of take this time to maybe say what you don't want to have left unsaid, right? And make those amends if appropriate. And so I guess I just kind of talked over my notes here. So clarify any misunderstanding or express what should have been said earlier. Say your goodbyes, right? And then prepare for your life moving forward. That can be a good benefit, right? Because you know it's coming. And so you can make those preparations. You're not blindsided by it, right? And so when you do this, you may have less distress and be better able to navigate the bereavement when your loved one dies, okay? There we go. So I do want to talk briefly about something called prolonged grief disorder. Now, I'm pretty sure they've updated the terms, so maybe I'm using an outdated term, but it's essentially the same. And this is just where your anticipatory grief really is just kind of like a prelude to conventional grief, right? So it doesn't bolster the person for the harsh reality of losing someone. And it also doesn't prepare them for the life ahead, right? Like I was saying before, sometimes you can be proactive with anticipatory grief, and sometimes it just prolongs your grief, right? It just makes it harder for a longer period of time. So some studies have shown that anticipatory grief can be like holding your breath until the real pain begins. Okay, they're bracing for impact. You're not being proactive. There was a study issued by the National Cancer Institute. They found that widows who stayed with their dying husbands until death could only truly mourn once the death had occurred. Okay, so if you are experiencing anticipatory grief and you're in a state where you're not feeling like you can be proactive, that's normal too. Okay, however, prolonged grief disorder does have its own set of symptoms. And again, there's no timeline for grief, but this is just kind of like if you are experiencing these symptoms maybe 6 months out after the loved one died, where you are, 6 months later, you're still feeling the same way as you did the day it happened. Okay. There's been no progress. Like it is still that raw and that intense. You may be at risk of having this prolonged grief disorder. Okay. So it says that between 7 and 10% of bereaved adults meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. And so these are symptoms that persist for 6 months or more after your loved one has gone. So this can include feelings that a part of yourself has died, right? Yes, your loved one died, but so did you, right? That's kind of how you see it. Your life ended when theirs did, okay? And again, that is normal in the beginning, right? But if this is happening 6 months or longer after the death, it may be a sign that maybe you need some extra support, okay? Maybe you're having a hard time believing the death even happened, right? Maybe you're in denial. You're like, I can't believe this happened. And it happened a long time ago, and I'm still in this state of shock, right? Maybe you'll avoid anything that reminds you of the death, right? Maybe you can't drive past the hospital, or maybe the last time you guys went out to eat, now you can't ever walk into an Applebee's again, or what have you, right? Difficulty engaging with friends, pursuing your interests, or planning for the future. Again, you're just kind of stuck in this grief space, and there's no positive outlook for you to motivate you to get up and move forward in the healing process. Okay. Emotional numbness. Again, that could just be part of the shock, right? It's better to not feel than feel what I want, what's brimming underneath, right? So you just kind of shut down emotionally, you go numb. And that could just be a natural response that you experience in your body, or you could go out of your way to numb yourself by using unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? Drugs and alcohol, doom scrolling, or, getting sucked into like television and things like that, just these little like numbing type distractions, okay? Feeling that your life is meaningless now, right? Your loved one has passed. What's the point? Or I was so wrapped up in my identity as a caregiver, I don't have any purpose now. What do I do with the rest of my life now that somebody doesn't need me? Okay, and that's normal to feel that way. And then feeling alone or detached from others, right? You just really feel like you could be in a crowded room and feel completely alone, okay? These are normal feelings to experience after the loss of somebody. But again, just be mindful that if this is where you are 6 months or longer out, doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, okay? It doesn't mean that you're experiencing something bad. It just means that maybe you need somebody to hold your hand to kind of pull you out of this fog, okay? And that's completely okay. It's completely normal. And it is appropriate to reach out for those supports when you feel that you need them, okay? So how do we work through anticipatory grief? Um, these are just some suggestions, okay? Find what works for you, okay? But these are ways that we can all just kind of reach a different space, right? Where we can kind of start to cope, okay? And I will not ever advocate for someone to rush into trying to cope and feel better, the day of or the day after, right? Feel your feelings, okay? Yes, it's gonna suck and it's gonna hurt and it's not gonna be fun, but you're going to eventually feel them. So you may as well feel them in the process as they come up, rather than stuffing them down. And then 10 years later, you don't know why you can't stop having migraines or whatever, right? Your grief is going to surface and come out and be processed in some way. So it's good to let nature take its course, right? We don't want to suppress these feelings, and we want to make sure we are dealing with them in healthy ways that are not harming ourselves or other people. Okay. So 5 ways to work through anticipatory grief. Allow the feelings of grief to help you prepare. Okay, so again, take time to examine any unresolved issues between you and your loved one. Okay, say what needs to be said. And of course, if your family member is well enough, if they have the cognitive capacity to have conversations about settling legal or financial matters, discussing end of life wishes. Okay, this is a great time to be proactive in that space. And maybe even doing these things can give you a sense of control when you feel like you have no control, right? Because essentially you can care for your loved one as best as you can, but they will inevitably pass, right? And you can't stop that from happening. And so this can maybe give you some solid ground to stand on and say, I can't prevent this from happening, but I can at least smooth the transition as quickly as, or as easily as possible for both of us, right? And also having these conversations with your loved one, that may put them at rest, right? They may feel some peace saying, okay, they've got this, right? If and when, I pass, I know they're going to be okay, right? So it can be very comforting for both of you to be proactive. Next, educate yourself about what to expect. Okay. Sometimes we get blindsided because we put on the blinders and we plug our ears and we no, 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 no. Like we don't want to hear it. We don't want to know what's happening. And then it happens and it terrifies us because we don't know what to expect. And so all of it's just kind of coming at us very quickly. So educating yourself about your loved one's condition, knowing symptoms, right? Side effects from any treatments, and of course their prognosis. When you understand what's coming down the pike, it may help you feel in control, okay? And I know if you are working with hospice nurses, hospice care providers, they're really good about educating you about the dying process, what that looks like, what to expect. So that way, when those symptoms arise, they're coming, and so they are not as shocking or jarring to you, okay? Next, talk to somebody who's also feeling this way, right? When we see ourselves in other people, we see our suffering in common humanity. It's a great gateway to offer ourselves self-compassion, right? Oh, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Okay, this is normal. I'm allowed to feel this way. Okay, so talking about it to other people, whether they're currently experiencing it or they have experienced it, can be very, very beneficial to you. Finding support groups of people who are experiencing the same thing, even if it's online, even if it's just coming to these trainings every Friday, right? Some of us in some way or shape or form are experiencing grief. And so to be in a space with others who understand that can be very, very healing, even when you feel like you're falling apart, right? Someone in a similar situation can provide a lot of insight, okay? And it's okay to be honest about your feelings. You're not being disrespectful to your family member or your loved one if you express your frustration, okay? Of course, I'm not advocating that you go in there and dump all your frustration on your loved one who's dying, right? That's where you find other people who've walked this journey or who are walking with you, and you can share those frustrations with them, okay? Or even if it's just journaling, right? That can help too. Enlist help and continue to live your life. Okay, so this one can be kind of tricky for those of us who are maybe feeling guilty for stepping away from the grief or stepping away from the caregiving role to come up for air a little bit, right? You say, I know my loved one's dying and I don't want to waste any time that I could be spending with them out to coffee with my friend, right? And that makes sense, right? That's a very practical way to see it. However, um, if you put your life on hold, in the long run, it can really impact the way that you respond and react to your loved one. So what do I mean by that? If you are knee deep, neck deep, above your head in grief 24/7, and you do not give yourself respite, you do not give yourself a break, you do not give yourself time to come up for air, you're going to be incredibly stressed out. You're going to be incredibly irritable. You're going to be probably more angry, right? Because you haven't had that time to decompress. And so what's that going to look like when you interact with your loved one? Probably not so great, right? So by stepping away and giving yourself that space to kind of relieve yourself from that grief a little bit or relieve yourself from that stress a little bit, it's going to help you to be better composed and better equipped to care for your loved one without that reactivity, right? You're going to be able to respond rather than react, okay? So caring for yourself is caring for your loved one, even in the very end, okay? I would say especially towards the very end, because it is going to be incredibly intense. So it's good to have that time where you can just kind of step away, right? And I'm not saying, go on a weekend trip and whatever. I mean, if you want to, that's fine. I'm just saying small bites, right? We don't want to have these expectations of what rest looks like. It's whatever you need, take that, okay? Let's see here. Create moments that your family member can enjoy, okay? So even though your loved one may not be able to participate in the same way that they used to before, they can still enjoy pleasurable activities with you, right? So maybe you take your mom outside for some fresh air or play some music that you both enjoy. Maybe do simple puzzles if you're able or if they're able to do it, right? And these moments may be what you cherish the most towards the end, right? And you think, well, how am I gonna, if I'm really stressed and I haven't given myself any breaks and I'm just steeped in this despair all the time, and then you go to do a puzzle with your loved one and then that frustrates you, right? That's not going to be a cherished moment that you're cultivating, right? So again, it's a good thing to step away and take those breaks so that you can fully invest in enjoying and cherishing those moments when they do come. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk briefly about unresolved grief. Okay. So healthy grief is what we're going to experience when we allow ourselves to feel the loss, right? We're going to allow ourselves to feel the pain of that loss. We're not going to stuff it down. We're not going to mask it. We're not going to numb it. Okay. We're going to let it be what it is. Okay. We take time to identify and understand what we're feeling. And over time, we can accept what's happened. Okay. Even though we never lose the pain of missing that person, we're still going to be able to continue living and experience happiness. Okay. As human beings, we often live through our intellect, right? We plan our actions and our reactions, but grief is not an intellectual reaction, right? It is a very emotional reaction. So we can't really think our way out of grief. We can use strategies, right? We can use things like reframing and ritual and things like that. But we can't think ourselves through grief. We have to just experience it, right? So we need to kind of climb into that roller coaster that we were talking about earlier and just kind of let go, right? And it's okay to hurt and it's okay to lose your way. And telling yourself that you're fine when you're not, that's just going to bury that pain even deeper, right? Again, it's going to come out, right? You can try to ignore it and carry on as normal. And you might even tell yourself, well, in 2 years, I'm going to be okay. Because maybe somebody told you that's how long it takes to get over losing someone that you love. And so maybe you're just waiting for that time to kind of run out and not really process the grief. But that's not the way it works, right? If you don't do anything, you just get used to bearing the pain, right? And you build your life around that pain, that unacknowledged, unnamed pain, right? You know it's there, it's going to stay there, unresolved until you do something about it, okay? So that's just what grief is, right? You can't control it, you can't predict it, but it is a lot easier to bear your sadness if you aren't also beating yourself up for being sad, right? You're going to be sad for as long as you're going to be sad. Okay. Unfortunately, we kind of live in that society where we want those easy, instant, quick fix kind of results, right? And we think, well, it's been a year, I should feel better, or it's been 6 months, I should feel better, right? But we also have to know it's important that there's beauty and benefits in being patient with ourselves, right? And being compassionate towards ourselves. And death is an emotional trauma, right? Losing someone is an emotional trauma. And so we have to treat it with that same sacredness and dignity that it deserves, right? We don't want to ignore it and just hope that the time will heal all wounds, okay? No, that's not true, okay? Time does help, but you also have to intentionally heal those wounds, right? You can't just, slice yourself really deep and say, well, time will heal it. And then in the meantime, it's getting infected and festering, right? We have to dress the wound. We have to take care of ourselves so that it does heal and it heals well. Okay. So how do we complete the grief process? We talked a little bit about, actually, did I even read those? Let me read the symptoms of unresolved grief before I continue. Sorry about that. So this is what unresolved grief may look like, okay? You don't want to talk about or acknowledge the loss. You just want to ignore it, right? It's fine. I'm good. I don't want to talk about this. And I feel like this is usually more prevalent in those of you who've been socialized as male, right? Because, boys don't cry, that kind of thing. We all know that's not true. So it's often, these harder feelings are often avoided or masked with unhealthy coping mechanisms. So if you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to acknowledge it, that's a sign that you have unresolved grief, okay? Overactivity, so working too hard or spending too much time in a hobby to distract yourself. And there's nothing wrong with distractions, right? But they have to have a timeline, okay? Sometimes we use distraction to come up for air, right? To give ourselves a break from that grief. And that's healthy, that's normal, that's appropriate. But if it's overactivity, right? That's all you're doing. You're not pausing to feel your feelings, okay? That's when it becomes problematic. You started to isolate and detach yourself from family and friends. Again, some of you grieve privately, and that's okay, right? I'm one of those people, right? stuff starts to get tricky in my world, I isolate, okay? But I also know that I can't stay there, okay? It's okay to retreat and do some introspection and all that. But if you are digging yourself a hole that nobody can find you in, that's a problem, okay? That's when you need to check yourself, right? Kind of course correct. You're indulging in bad habits. So overeating, undereating, drinking too much alcohol, risky behaviors, things like that. Okay. Just again, those unhealthy coping mechanisms. And they work, right, for a time. They don't help you heal. Okay. They just mask, they just bury it deeper. Maybe you're sleeping more than usual. Again, not uncommon, right? We have these moments of sadness, maybe even some depression, right? And you're going to sleep more. That's okay, but it cannot be a long-term solution. Okay. You're overreacting to a relatively small event, right? And this can happen to all of us, regardless of where we are on the path of our grief. Um, but maybe you're being more explosive and you don't really understand why, right? Why is this feel so raw? Why does this feel so tender? It's because the wound never healed. Okay, so if somebody touches up against it, it's gonna, right? It's gonna sting a little bit. Okay. You avoid getting close to people or starting new relationships for fear of being hurt. Maybe the loss impacted you so much. You're like, I don't want to love that way again because I don't want it to hurt this bad when it's over. Okay. That's normal, right? And there's even a little bit of poetry in that space, right? Like, I understand that we're humans. We want to avoid what hurts us. But again, isolation, not being in community with people, not opening ourselves up for love, friendship, kindness, compassion, that's not going to help you heal. Okay. So if you don't do anything to reconcile your losses, it doesn't matter how much time passes, the pain will remain and be as strong as ever. Okay. All right. Now I'll move on to the next slide. Completing the grief process. Get closure, right? I think sometimes, especially if our loved one passes unexpectedly, there's getting closure can be very difficult, right? But one way that you can do this is write out your thoughts, talk with other loved ones or friends about the loss, right? We saw how unresolved grief can occur when we don't talk to other people, when we isolate and we deny our feelings. We get closure by doing the opposite, right? Talk to friends, talk to family, talk to spiritual leaders in your life, whomever, talk to a therapist, right? This is a good way to, we call it like narrative therapy, right? We tell our story about it and it can really help us process. Okay. Move towards what you might be avoiding, right? Visit the grave site, especially if you've been finding excuses to avoid it. That's a good example. Okay. That can kind of help you if you're still in a space of disbelief or shock. Of course, I would recommend that if you are in a space of disbelief or shock, maybe invite somebody to come along with you, right? You don't want to go there by yourself and then not be able to drive yourself home or what have you. Okay. It can be very, very upsetting. It can be very, very sad, and you may not know how you'll react. So it's always good to have somebody there to support you. Behaviorally change your patterns. So if you've fallen into those bad patterns, right? Maybe after your loved one passes, you found yourself at the bottom of a wine bottle for 2 weeks, right? That's normal, right? We cope in all different kinds of ways. But if you found yourself falling into those patterns, we're going to want to change those after some time, right? Those are what we call maladaptive coping mechanisms, which means they don't benefit us. They don't help us progress through the grieving process. They kind of keep us stuck. So we don't want to indulge in that space for too long, right? Pushing against your anxiety-driven behaviors, like those coping mechanisms, can help you feel more in control and stop that negative cycle, okay? So we just want to be very aware, not shame ourselves when we find ourselves in the spaces, but just be aware enough to say, okay, well, now it's time to get up, brush my teeth, shake the dirt off my hands, whatever you got to do, right? And move forward in the process, okay? And then finally, consider therapy. Okay, not everybody needs therapy. Okay, not everybody benefits from therapy, but a lot of us do. Okay, having somebody trained that understands the grieving process, that can normalize it for you, that can validate it for you, and then give you some good coping skills to replace maybe some of those negative ones you picked up, that can be incredibly beneficial. Okay. It's very difficult and it's often tied to other core issues when we grieve. A therapist can help you kind of navigate that, right? Help you put words to what you're feeling. And so grief is about you and your relationships with other people. And it helps to have other people help you with your grief. Okay, think about it. We're human beings, we're communal creatures. We were built for community, right? Our entire nervous system is designed to feel safe in community with people. And so if you isolate yourself, if you separate yourself from people that care about you or people that can hold your hand through it, you're not doing yourself any favors. Okay, you're not allowing your nervous system to integrate and reset, right? It's just going to kind of spiral in this haywire all the time, right? So community, even if it's just one person, right? One professional, one close friend, one, clergy member, whomever, don't go it alone. Okay, don't go it alone. So that's my information for you today. This is my contact information. So if you do want to reach out to me and schedule a care chat, I am available Monday through Friday, except Wednesdays. I don't work Wednesdays, but leave me an email or voicemail and I will return your call or your message as soon as I get back into the office. And even if you just want to reach out to me today, I'll be here till 4. All right.